Theo chương trình, buổi lễ công bố sẽ bước sang phần thứ hai. Ở phần này, chúng ta
of the event today, we will be listening to the team PAPI team members that talking about the findings of PAPI index, the performance at the national and provincial levels, and issues of greatest concerns in 2021. First, we will have Dr. Schuler with the presentation on governance and public administration performance and issues of greatest concerns in 2021. He is associate professor at the University of Arizona, an international expert on the PAPI quality assurance. Xin kính chào tất cả quý vị, và tôi cũng rất mừng là có mặt ở đây. Sau 3 năm thì đây là lần đầu tiên được phát biểu trực tiếp như thế này tại sự kiện công bố PAPI, và ngày hôm nay tôi sẽ trình bày với các quý vị
perspective to look at the evolution of some of the issues that citizens are interested in 2021 as compared to previous years, as well as looking at some of the indicators have changed over time. So in terms of the presentation, I'm going to have 4 major sections. First, I'm going to provide an overview of some of the major events that occurred in 2021. And the main is this working? To provide the context for what the findings are going to show. Then I'm going to look at the issues of greatest concern from the citizens' perspective, looking at the issues that citizens are most concerned with. Then we're going to look at in the election in 2021, and then finally the PAPI results from the national level. All right, in terms of the context for 2021, should I use a microphone? Yeah, I think it's cutting out. All right, this works a little better. Okay, so in terms of the national developments that are going to impact not just my presentation, but also some of the findings that will come later. In 2021, there was at the beginning of the year, a party congress which expressed an emphasis on trying to create a modern and effective national governance set of reforms. There was also an election in May of 2021 for the People's Council and the National Assembly. And then finally, it's the first year of the new government term, which will last from 2021 until 2026. Second, I'm sure I don't need to tell all of you this, but also impacting many of our findings is the 4th wave of COVID-19, which critically occurred right before we went into the field for most of the provinces. And so many of the responses that you see are going to have taken place immediately after many of the citizens experienced lockdowns, particularly in the Mekong Delta. And of course, this not only impacted health and health concerns, it also impacted the economy, as we'll see reflected in some of what I'm going to talk about over the next few slides. And then finally, we were able to get access this year to the 2019 census data, which was important because it allowed us to do a resampling to make sure that our survey was as representative as possible. And we were also able to gain information about migrants and where they live in Vietnam so we could survey that critical population. Now, with this new census data, as has been mentioned a couple times before, the responses that we're going to be analyzing are from 15,833 respondents across Vietnam, which brings the total of number of respondents throughout the 13 years to 162,066. So this is truly an amazing and immense, massive undertaking. All right, so the first thing I always like to go over when going over the findings, because I think it provides sort of the best picture or snapshot of what's on the minds of citizens, is an answer to an open-ended question we've been asking every year since 2015, which is, what is the issue that you think government should address in the upcoming year? And so this is a completely open-ended question, so citizens can say whatever they want. And this year, the top concern for citizens was health and health insurance. It was 23% of respondents saying this is the issue that they think government should address. Second was poverty and hunger reduction at 19%. And then third was economic growth and GDP growth. Now, I think to provide some context for this, I think it's useful to show how this has changed over time. We can see that poverty and hunger reduction has been an important concern for citizens really since we started asking this question in 2015. And actually, the rate of concern about that issue this year is about the same as when we first started asking this question in 2015. I think what most of you can see from this graph, however, which is most striking, is the dramatic increase of people's concern about health and health insurance, which perhaps not surprisingly was very low before 2020. With the start of the COVID pandemic, we saw it increase rapidly to 15%, and then this year, 23% of people were concerned about this as their primary issue. Also important, and we'll talk a little bit about this, concerns about the economy were also important this year. So while citizens were concerned about health and health insurance, they were also concerned about employment and GDP growth. And so since the COVID pandemic has started, we've seen a dramatic uptick in the number of people concerned about the economy. And we'll talk about why that is. And then one final thing to note is we're going to spend a lot of time paying attention to the economy and COVID and healthcare, and rightfully so. But I think it's also important to highlight the areas that we might not be paying as much attention to as people have shifted their focus elsewhere. And we can see here that the environment, which had been an important concern prior to COVID-19, we did see a pretty steep drop in the number of people that were concerned about this particular issue. And so this will be something important to think about moving forward. Now, we do like to break down the differences in concern about various issues by gender. And this is going to be important when we think about differences in participation between men and women in local government. If people have different perspectives on what issues are most important based on gender, we want to make sure that we have women and men participating at same rates at local levels. And so we do see that there are some important gender differences for issues that citizens care about. Women are much more likely to be concerned with poverty and hunger reduction and education quality at 4 to 6 percentage points different than men. Men are much more concerned with national security, infrastructure quality, and GDP growth. Now, looking from an ethnic lens, we also disaggregated between ethnic minorities and ethnic king majority, and we see some subtle differences between ethnic minorities, where ethnic minorities are most concerned with poverty and hunger reduction. Health and health insurance is the second most important issue, and those top two priorities are reversed for ethnic majority king. Now, why are citizens concerned about healthcare? We want to probe a little bit more deeply to figure out what is the reason underlying the concern about health and health insurance. Obviously, COVID-19 is the primary cause, but we also see when we look at some of the indicators in PAPI that there has been an increased strain on the hospitals and public hospital across the country. When we look at the percentage of people who are satisfied with their most recent visits to the hospitals, we can see that it's been between 57 and 60% of people that have been satisfied with their most recent visits to hospitals. That number dropped in 2021 to 54%, perhaps reflecting the increased strain that we saw in the hospital sector. And so this could perhaps be a reason why citizens are concerned with health and the health sector. The other issue that citizens were concerned about was the economy. And to sort of probe the reasons why citizens were concerned about this, we wanted to see whether or not citizens were increasingly pessimistic about the economic performance of Vietnam. And so one of the questions we asked to help analyze this is a question that asks whether or not citizens feel the overall national economy is in good, bad, or neither good nor bad shape. And what you can see here is pretty striking. People have been generally positive about the overall economic performance in Vietnam since we started asking this question in 2018. But in 2021, we see a dramatic increase in the number of people who said the economic situation was bad, going from 11% to almost 20% this in 2021. And the number of people saying that the economic situation was good, declining from 57% in 2020 to 46% in 2021. Now, this is citizens' overall evaluations of the national economy. When we look to citizens' own pocketbooks, their own personal economic situation, we also asked whether or not citizens thought their own economic situation had improved in the last few years or not. So was their situation better or worse or the same as before? And what you can see here is that since 2011, when we first started asking this question, about 60% of citizens routinely said that their economic situation had been improving. And this is pretty consistent even up until last year, the first year of the COVID pandemic. But what we can see here is with the lockdowns and for the first time declines in overall GDP growth, citizens were increasingly concerned about their own economic situations, with only 52% of people saying their own economic situations had gotten better, and a record 29% of people saying that their economic situations had gotten worse. And so we do see increased concerns about the economy. Now, obviously, this likely has a lot to do with COVID, and so one of the questions that we also asked is whether or not citizens experienced income or job losses as a result of COVID in 2021. We also asked this question in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. And what you can see here is that although citizens had experienced negative economic outcomes in 2020, they dramatically increased in 2021. So 2021 was qualitatively worse than 2020 in terms of the impact that COVID wrought on the economy. We can see that the number of people who said they experienced some form of job loss increased from 25% to 37%, and income loss also increased in 2021. So some key takeaways for the overall issues that citizens are concerned about. COVID-19 clearly shifted people's concerns in 2021. There was an increased strain on the health sector, and so attention should be paid to medical care provision across the country in the upcoming years. There should also be increased focus on the overall economic conditions. I'm sure this is not news to anybody in policy-making positions, but poverty assistance and stimulus packages, which were rolled out, would appear to be vital to help stem some of the devastation in terms of economic impacts of COVID. And then finally, we did want to just highlight that whilst attention should be paid to these very pressing concerns of health and the economy, we should also be paying attention to some of the issues that were previously important concerns that may perhaps taken a back seat as the attention is shifted to the economy and healthcare. And in particular, the environment is an issue that, although citizens aren't necessarily focusing on it, policymakers should probably keep their eyes on that. All right. So now I want to turn, because we had an election year in 2021 amidst the pandemic, I want to turn to an evaluation of participation in the election in 2021. And in particular, we want to look to see whether or not in the May 2021 election, whether participation of in-person voting increased or decreased as compared to previous years. And then within participation in the elections, we also want to look at a gender breakdown to see whether men or women were equally likely to participate, and whether efforts to try to increase the gender equity in government positions, particularly in the National Assembly and village leadership positions, whether citizens are responding by being equally supportive of men or women holding these positions. We also have some other things in the report related to grassroots democracy implementation, which I won't have time to talk about in today's presentation, but given the debate over the upcoming draft law on grassroots democracy, I would encourage all of you to look at some of those findings. So looking at voting in the elections, we compared the 2021 results to the previous elections where we also surveyed, so 2011, 2016, which were the previous elections, to see the percentage of people that voted in person. In some cases, we may have people that are voting on behalf of other family members, and so we wanted to look to see what percentage of people actually went to go vote in person for elections at various levels. And so we asked about votes for village heads, votes for the People's Council deputies, and votes for the National Assembly. And what we can see is that perhaps, and quite likely due to fears of COVID-19, again, these elections took place during the pandemic, we do see record low numbers of participation in the National Assembly elections. Now, we could view this in two ways. One is that the numbers have declined somewhat since previous years. However, we could also perhaps suggest that given fears about COVID, this actually represents a fairly large number of people participating. But at any rate, in terms of the People's Council elections and the National Assembly delegate elections, we've seen a drop of about 5 to 6 percentage points in both of these elections. Perhaps more interesting is looking at a gender breakdown in terms of men or women's participation in these elections. So who's actually going on behalf of some of the families? And here we can see that in 2021, there really hasn't been a narrowing of the gap that we've seen consistently since 2011. Since 2011, there's been about a 10 to 15 percentage point gap between men and women going to vote in elections. And that number has remained fairly steady up until 2021. Now, this is important because if we go back to the beginning of this presentation, we know that men and women have slightly different interests. And so if men and women are participating at different rates, this could perhaps have an impact on the types of issues that are being presented to local officials. And so this is certainly something to keep an eye on in the future. One other thing that we wanted to look at, just to conclude this discussion of elections and the performance of elections, is whether or not citizens themselves prefer men or women to hold government positions. Now, there's been an effort in the National Assembly and in the most recent election law to try to increase the number of women who are elected to the National Assembly. And so we wanted to ask citizens whether or not they actually wanted men or women to hold these positions. And so we created a question where we gave respondents hypothetical candidates for village head elections and also National Assembly delegate elections, and then varied whether the candidate was a man or a woman to see what percentage of citizens had a preference for a man or a woman. And what's perhaps encouraging is, given all the efforts to try to increase gender equity in the National Assembly, citizens actually seem to have basically no preference between men or women for the National Assembly, which is a heartening finding. Interestingly, however, when we look for different positions, the village head positions, which are very close to citizens, there we do see a persistent bias. People have about a 2 to 3 percentage point higher preference for men over women. And so this suggests that while there's been progress in terms of gender equity, in terms of citizens' preferences for the National Assembly and for legislative positions, efforts could be done to try to improve the degree to which citizens are open to women serving in village head positions. So just some key takeaways. Again, I think COVID-19 had an important impact on the election results. There should be increased effort to try to improve the equity between men and women participating in the elections, and I think the findings also demonstrate some interesting areas where citizens might express preferences for men and women at different levels of government. Again, I think there's some other interesting findings pertaining to grassroots democracy that's in the report, which I don't have time to get into, but certainly in the Q&A, if you have questions about that part, please raise those questions. All right, finally, and this will conclude my presentation, we're going to go briefly through the PAPI findings, which Denghuang Zhang will go through in greater detail in his presentation. But I wanted to provide an overview of the trends in the overall PAPI indicators from a national perspective. Now, in terms of Dimension 1, which measures participation at local levels, you can see that there's been a slight decrease there. We've already explained some of the indicators that are behind that decrease. Decreased participation in elections, decreased contributions to local voluntary contribution projects. Those are the reasons why we've seen a slight drop in Dimension 1. What I'm going to focus on in the remainder of the presentation, and Dr. Zhang will pick this up in his presentation, the other dimensions, I'm going to focus on Dimension 2, transparency, Dimension 4, control of corruption in the public sector, and Dimension 6, public service delivery, to help explain why we see either no changes or some changes in those particular dimensions. So in terms of transparency, Dimension 2, this is a graph showing all of the different components that go into transparency, the transparency indicator. And what you can see here is that transparency of land use plans and the land pricing framework is the primary reason for the decline in the transparency score. So citizens were decreasingly likely to say that they were aware of land use plans or had an opportunity to comment on them in the previous year. And so what you can see here is two of the components that make up the land transparency dimension: opportunities to comment on land use plans, informed about land use plans. Both of those have decreased in 2021. Now, one perhaps interesting explanation for why we see this is, with a partner organization, we did an analysis of whether or not we could find information about those land use frames ourselves if we went and looked. So this is a so-called audit research plan. So we actually had a team partnered with the UNDP that went on the websites of all these different districts and all the provinces to try to see whether we could find the land use frames. And what we found is that despite the fact that these levels of government are supposed to have these frames, many of them, in fact less than half of them, actually did. And so to try to improve the transparency and the availability of this information, it may be useful to try to increase the degree to which there's compliance with providing these sources of information online. Now, I did want to spend a brief moment talking about corruption and reduction of corruption, because corruption is the indicator that most strongly correlates with overall satisfaction with government. So every year, this is the most important dimension in terms of overall satisfaction with government. And we can see here is that on the positive light, we haven't seen a decline in the corruption scores. However, for the first time since the anti-corruption campaign began in 2016, we haven't seen improvement either. There have been, in some of the subdimensions, equity in state employment and nepotism, there have been slight improvements. However, limits on corruption in local government, which assesses the degree to which citizens are paying bribes, we have seen a slight decline. And so this graph shows whether or not citizens felt that it was important or somewhat important to have connections to local government in order to get hired. And there we see a very encouraging sign that across the board for various positions at the local level, citizens are decreasingly finding it likely that you have to be connected to these officials in order to get a job at those positions. So that is certainly an encouraging indicator. However, when we look at whether or not bribes are necessary across a range of public services, there we see a more mixed bag. So we can clearly see that there's been improvement since 2016. So every year since 2016, after the anti-corruption campaign began, we did see steady declines in bribes and bribe taking across the country. However, in 2021, we've seen some stalling and, in fact, some slight increases across some of these public services. So for public healthcare services, as was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, a slight increase in the degree to which citizens thought bribes were necessary there. And then construction permits and teacher favoritism also experienced a slight increase. And so looking at bribe taking, this is an area that we want to make sure that we see continued improvement in the upcoming years. And then finally, I want to finish in talking about public service delivery, because this is one of the dimensions that showed pretty stark improvement. And when we look at the different components that make up public service delivery, public healthcare, primary education, basic infrastructure, and crime, or law and order, we can see pretty clearly that the big reason for the increase was a dramatic improvement in law and order. So citizens felt there was a decreasing level of crime in the country in 2021. Now, one obvious explanation for that could be the COVID pandemic meant many people were at home or not driving in their vehicles as much, and so were less likely to experience crime in that manner. And in fact, this is what the findings bear out. So as compared to previous years, if we looked at whether or not citizens experienced a vehicle theft or a break-in, we're at all-time lows of citizens experiencing any of these crimes. And this is actually consistent across other crime indicators that comprise this dimension. And so whether or not this is something to do with governance or something to do more with temporary nature because of the COVID pandemic, that's something that we'll have to see in the 2022 round of the survey. All right, so that's a lot of information. PAPI obviously has a wealth more of information, some of which will be discussed in subsequent presentations. But I think just some key takeaways. There was a substantial impact of COVID-19 on many of the indicators. Some bright spots, particularly public service delivery. Citizens, however, did feel that healthcare services were under increasing strain. In the transparency dimension, we also see that there are some areas that could be improved in terms of transparency in the land use frames. And then in terms of corruption, we would like to see whether or not these declines in corruption, whether this decrease in the declines, whether that's a temporary phenomenon or whether that continues in the future. With that, thanks so much for your attention and look forward to any questions later on. Thank you.